Hello respected viewers, I'm George from Ireland. Here I am at the Italian port of Livorno, sometimes known in English as Leghorn. So this is where Percy Bysshe Shelley set sail for the last time exactly 200 years ago today. So Shelley is best known as a British poet. There's so many famous poems, the Queen Mab, Ozymandias, the Revolt of Islam, and so on. Very Ode to the West Wind. But anyway, this is mostly to talk about the last day of his life. He'd been living in Italy for several years prior to that. Well, since since 1816, really. Anyway, so he set sail in his boat Ariel, along with two other British men. Nobody else was on board. They were going to sail across the Gulf of Lerici, sometimes called the Gulf of La Spezia, and they're going to meet Leigh Hunt and Lord Byron, who were close by, and he was going to discuss with them launching a magazine called the Liberal. Liberal had only just started to bear a political signification in the English language at that time, but Shelley was not to see the first edition of the magazine. It indeed was published, but it only lasted a few years. But a sudden squall brewed up and the boat capsized. Shelley and his two shipmates, they both drowned. But people didn't know that at the time. The voyage was only meant to last a few hours. It didn't come to the harbour. That evening his family got frantic when they found out he hadn't arrived. The next few days his wife and his friends were going around the neighbouring ports asking if there was any word of them. Remember, the population was much smaller. There was a tiny British expatriate community. He stuck out like a sore thumb, was quite well known in the locality because he'd been here on and off for a few years. 10 days later the bodies washed up on Viareggio, a bit north of here. It was part of the kingdom of Sardinia at the time. Sardinia was both peninsular as well as insular back then, but the regulation required that when people died in such circumstances, their bodies must be immediately cremated, and indeed they were burned there on the beach. So Leigh Hunt and Lord Byron were present at their funeral. It wasn't a religious funeral. They were both, well, Percy was vociferously anti-religious, but Edward Trelawney, another British friend of theirs, he snatched the heart from the fire, which didn't quite burn because of some medical condition that Percy Bysshe Shelley had. Shelley had been in Italy for a number of reasons, partly to escape his unpayable debts, even though the bankers tracked him down and were always hassling him for repayment. Also for health reasons. He thought that this milder, drier climate better for him. His friend John Keats had come to Italy for the same reason, but Keats was mortally ill with tuberculosis. Although Shelley and Keats never actually managed to meet in Italy, because Keats died in Rome in February 1821 at the age of just 25. Shelley was a bit north of Rome, like here, and he found out only a few weeks later that Shelley had died, that Keats had died. Of course, news travelled very, very slowly back then. There wasn't even a reliable postal service. Yeah, so that was Shelley. He'd lived here with his wife, with his children. His child Wilmouse, his other child Clara, had both died in Italy. So his wife Mary, formerly Mary Godwin, was heartbroken. She said that they'd come to Italy for their health, and yet it claimed the lives of two of their children. That's not necessarily why they died. They might have died anyway. But Wilmouse, his real name was William, died of fever, possibly malaria, which plagued Italy well into the late 19th century. Anyway, so they'd set sail on a yacht called Ariel, which Shelley had made for him. It was poorly designed. Some people say it was more or less a floating sarcophagus. And so then his ashes were kept by the British consul in Rome for a few months. A bit quite broad-minded that the British consul was willing to do so, considering that Shelley had constantly invaded against monarchy, against the British establishment, and openly scorned Christianity. So his ashes were eventually laid to rest in Cimitero a Cattolica at Rome. Edward John Trelawney purchased a plot beside him, and he was buried there decades later. John Keats is buried in the same cemetery, only about 100 paces away. But Shelley's heart was kept by Leigh Hunt, wrapped in a page of one of Keats's poems, preserved in alcohol, and after decades he relented and gave it to Percy's widow, Mary Shelley, who eventually buried it. It was buried in Bournemouth when she died. So that's a little bit about Percy Bysshe Shelley. Byron had been around here all the time in Villamagni, a little bit north of here. Byron had gone off to Greece to help start the Greek Revolution, to fight with them to throw off the Ottoman yoke. One thing is Percy was in the invidious situation of being friends who were enemies. He was a dear friend of both Lord Byron and indeed John Keats, but Byron and Keats loathed each other. Shelley, when he heard that Keats was very ill in the autumn of 1820, had written to Keats saying, well, why don't you come and spend this winter with me? Keats had readily accepted, but Shelley only felt able to do so because Byron was out of the country for a while. Because of course travel was slow, it was going to take weeks to get to Greece and weeks to get back. That September, Keats had set sail for Naples, eventually arrived in October, finally made it to Rome, but been in such poor health he could scarcely venture outdoors from his house in the Spanish Steps, and indeed died there. So Percy Bysshe Shelley has spent a lot of time in Florence, which is a bit inland from here, which is an incredibly richly historic city, just blessed with an embarrassment of art treasures, works by various writers as well as various artists, Michelangelo not least among them, but writers like Boccaccio had spent time there. And because of Keats, because of Shelley, that's why Robert Browning, his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning, lived there later. Their lifetimes overlapped with Shelley, but they never met him because they were children when he died. And the American poet Robert Lowell came to live there eventually. So Shelley, even though he was a political radical, he did not speak about the Italian scene, despite it really being a feudal society well into that time, despite the Church of the Church of Rome, as you might have been brought up to call it, being rather more obscurantist and oppressive than the Church of England. So Percy had always been keen on sailing on a little lake as a child in Sussex, where he grew up. Though he didn't eat fish, he was a vegetarian. There was a theory that their boat was rammed by some local men who wanted to rob them. The trouble with that theory is that none of their valuables were taken. The bodies were only identifiable by the clothes because they'd been in the sea for 10 days. They were horribly descended. They'd been nibbled at by fish. So, I mean, as Byron said, the carcass might as well have been that of a sheep. So only recognisable by the clothes. Plus, Shelley had a copy of Keats's Lamia in his pocket. That helped identify him. And some people say, is that what actually killed him? Because he took a moment to put it in his pocket rather than jumping free when the boat was capsizing or holding onto driftwood or something like that. I don't think any of them could swim. People usually didn't. And he thought it'd make a better seaman if he didn't swim, because you know that if your boat capsized or sank, that was it. You were doomed. I don't know if they even had a lifeboat with them. So that was the end of Shelley. He died on the 8th of July, and his 30th birthday would have been the 4th of August, but he never lived to see it. And despite him having such a short lease of life, he's achieved literary immortality, among the most celebrated poets of any language in all time. So Percy Bysshe Shelley and Keats, there's the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association, founded to immortalise their fame. However, there are no events going on in Italy here, incredibly. There were a few events in the run-up to the bicentennial. Shelley survived Keats by a year and a half. Keats died at the age of only 25 in Rome. So thank you so much for watching my channel. I could speak about them for hours, but I thought this is what I should say. Here I am in the historic port, the Medici port. You can see the enormous pleasure cruiser, or will I say, passenger ferry, liner, the mill, the historic watchtower, the Coast Guard, and so on. Okay, I'll switch it off now. Thank you, goodbye.